The first thing I think it's important to say to everybody is that bringing in a consultant can be one of the best decisions you make for your nonprofit. It could also be, truth be told, one of the worst. And the difference really depends on the process you use to identify, engage, work with, and even end your relationship with the consultant or the firm that we're talking about. So I want to get into a lot of those kinds of topics that relate to all this. And it's important to know that we are more and more living in what folks are calling a gig economy. So people have what they call side hustles or things that they do to make either extra income or flip into a full-time income job back and forth. And so you're going to encounter this more and more in your nonprofit work. But let's get started here. First of all, I thought it would really be helpful to talk about just what is a consultant. Let's define this a little bit here, right? And like I say here, the word is fraud. People have all sorts of definitions, but we're going to split hairs a little bit here. A lot of folks will just say, well, if you're just giving advice, then you're a consultant, and that's what consultants are. Other people would say, if you're completing a project of some sort, you're a freelancer, a contractor. If you're in sales, selling usually a more physical product, you're a vendor, but sometimes, software and all that too, right? But for our purposes, it's all the same. We're just going to call them all consultants because, your vendor, the person who might be selling you some physical or intangible product, they look at themselves sometimes as consultants because it's consultative sales. They're actually bringing information to you as part of that sales process. So I think it's important that we just kind of cover all these under that same blanket, and you can make these differences as you move ahead in your own work. So who are real jobs, right? And there's always a little bit of suspicion, well, gosh, why are you doing this instead of going someplace? And there are a lot of reasons, which actually for consultants makes it really hard to distinguish themselves because they may not be or may be one of these kind, and it kind of impacts how you work with them sometimes. So starting off, there's a lot of folks who are between paycheck jobs, right? They're in transition. They either don't feel comfortable saying that they're in between jobs. Personally, I think embrace it. And certainly in the fundraising field, there's less and less issues about being in transition. But regardless, some people like to call themselves consultants in between and might even pick up a job or two as they are between different places. And for some people, it actually is a pathway to a permanent position, being a consultant. So that's a good thing for them. Other people need a change of pace. Maybe they've really been in an intense situation for a long time. And not to say that consulting isn't intense, but it's certainly different than a regular paycheck job. And they drop out of their paycheck job and get into something that is a little bit different. There are a lot of trailing spouses in the consulting world. These are people who are married to somebody where they've moved and they take that one of the bread earners takes a job in a different city or something like that, and this person does consulting to kind of get them into the economy there, or maybe just permanently stays that way. There are a fair amount of people who need a flexible schedule, and I think we see this more and more. Of course, there's kind of traditional childcare responsibilities, but then also what I'm seeing is a lot of folks with special needs, children, often not necessarily minor children, but sometimes adult children they have to take care of or monitor, and elder care. That's a big one that I see a lot of, is folks are in consulting because they have the flexibility to deal with a parent or somebody older in their family. And, a lot of folks just always want to be a consultant, and that's a great thing. They are naturally inclined to take a broad set of skills and apply it in a number of places, and that's good. They like to work for themselves. That's always a positive attribute for consultants, but people get into and affect their own business, and especially if they've had family, families with businesses in them. They might enjoy the lifestyle. I have to confess that listening to the traffic reports on the radio while I am at my office at my house is one of the my life's pleasures. And they might also have another income of some sort, and whether it's a part-time job or retirement income. For a while, years ago, I was working with people who had military pensions, and so they weren't that old, but they were officially retired and doing other things. So why would you need to call a consultant? And this is really important to think of right up, and we're going to kind of come back to this theme a little bit as we move forward here. But when a problem or situation is simply painful, you got to take care of it now, and you don't have the expertise there. When you see the need for some short-term expertise you may not need over time, think of somebody coming in to fix your computers. For traditional consultant tasks like campaign feasibility studies, that's a traditional consultant task. When your staff is at maximum output, I've certainly had clients who say, I do a lot of writing. And they'll say, gosh, my staff just doesn't have time to do this, so they'll farm it out to somebody else. Or when you need temporary help to meet some service demand, that's certainly a time when you need a consultant. And yet, as a nonprofit, you have some other options. And the first thing you need to ask yourself is, can I do this in-house, right? Maybe, maybe not. Do you have staff in place? Maybe you don't have the skill sets in-house, or maybe that skilled person is overworked. I just mentioned something like that. Do you need a different perspective? Everybody's always been doing the same thing the same way, and you need to get some other way in your place to look at that. Or maybe the job is temporary in nature, and you really don't want to take somebody off task to kind of get them off focus and then refocus them and all that. You could hire somebody new. And really, a lot of times, especially in long-term consulting assignments, you see folks kind of weighing this back and forth. So you might think about, bringing somebody in new, but there's a whole set of HR issues that comes with that, and a commitment that you might not want to make. I mean, there's an ongoing expense. Like I said, have to go through the HR process. And then if it's a project-based thing, once it's done, do you keep the person or not? So that can have its issues. Now, for a nonprofit in particular, you could say, well, why don't I use a volunteer? And, unlike businesses, you have that option. Of course, the question is, can you identify a volunteer and who has that skill set that you need for the particular project you're doing? And that can, it's not just kind of going and picking up somebody off the street and saying, hey, can you do this? You need something done in a particular way, has a background of expertise. So a volunteer may or may not be able to handle that for you. You might have political reasons, internal, like organizational political reasons. You don't want to use a volunteer. You actually might be restricted by contracts with unions and others who may not, for certain jobs, allow you to take in volunteers. And maybe there's some conflict of interest there. So volunteers may or may not be the solution for you. Now, why a consultant instead of an employee, right? I mean, we talk a little bit about that, but I mean, like I said, it could be a temporary project. And do you bring somebody in and you have to let them go or not? You have unemployment and those sort of things. You can, with a consultant, have a low commitment level. So you can hire somebody pretty quickly. Sometimes that goes outside the HR process, and you can shed them pretty quickly. So you're not kind of embracing this person as a full member of the staff. And then budget restrictions. It's interesting. I find a lot of times, and certainly when my time in the paycheck job world was that consultants often did not fall under the same budget restrictions as my staff. So it's not going to be in payroll. And if you only have so much payroll money, but you can spend on a consultant from another line, it might be easier to bring that person in. And sometimes consultants are kind of considered like equipment, where you can bring them in and then use them and then sell them and in fact move them out. But all this also, it's important to ask yourself, what kind of work are you looking for a consultant to do? That's going to impact a lot of how you're going to handle this whole process. So starting off here, right? Episodic expertise. This is where a lot of consulting is used. Think of grant proposals, think of marketing projects, bringing on a new software program of some sort, right? So you bring them in, they do their job, the project's over, off they go. And and you can kind of draw a circle around that's what that person is here to do. Ongoing expertise. Now, you don't see this quite so much, but it depends on how you define ongoing. I mean, campaigns now, fundraising campaigns last 4 months, years, right? So maybe you have somebody working with you on an ongoing basis. How about coaching? I certainly see that with some folks I work with, right, where they're coaching on an ongoing basis a particular staff person in an organization or a group of people, and so that's a longer term project. And then in that world of longer term project, right, there's interim leadership when you're in between, and sometimes bringing in an interim leader can be the best thing you can do because they can make a lot of changes that the next person doesn't have to look like the bad guy to make that happen. But that's a good way to use what somebody might call a consultant. What else? Kind of related to that interim leadership might be the hatchet man idea, where somebody is coming in to evaluate and make changes. They may not be an interim leader, but they might be the person who can make recommendations at a key moment of the organization's life to say, you ought to be doing this, you ought not to be doing that. The spark. Start a new program, get something up and running, maybe bring in somebody who has a lot of energy in a place that you need to have that energy because the staff for some reason isn't isn't organized or isn't pulling together like they should be. And I've seen this every once in a while, and with the right people it works out very well. It's kind of, you think about I'm from Philadelphia, right? And I'm not going to get into the Eagles, but you know that so much except to say that they changed coaches and a lot of things changed. And so maybe it's that like a little coach thing changed, and well, where they ended up this year. And then transfer knowledge. That's a really important skill that somebody can bring to your organization, that you just need to ramp up something that you don't know anything about. Maybe you're getting into social media and you need to learn about not only the mechanics of doing it, but a lot of the background for doing it. You can bring in somebody to, in effect, teach your people. In fact, I've done that. I've come in and taught people how to use direct mail, and that's been very helpful for the organization in the long term. Then evaluation, right? These are very valuable people because there's not a lot of them do this, who come in and evaluate something and can tell you whether you're doing on the right course or not. You see this a lot in the grant proposal world. Pinpoint an issue, right? Being a troubleshooter, pilot a new program, and even make contacts for you or help bring in other network contacts. And I'm not saying like in fundraising where you bring in other donors. I'm saying that you are somehow broadening that organization's network as a consultant to make them a stronger organization overall. So it's important, however, that people kind of step back and say, okay, so what's the impact of consulting? And one of the big questions I get is, won't a consultant just make more work for me? Well, yeah. Honestly, yeah, that is entirely possible. It might be that a consultant will not, particularly the kind who advise as opposed to the kind who are doing like some sort of project. It could well be that they're going to make more work for you. And but it really depends on what you're asking for them to do. Okay. So that's, and you have to supervise and approve what your consultant's doing for you. However, it's really important to keep in mind that even though you might be doing more work, you're going to end up as the person who is responsible for that consultant in your shop as a nonprofit, right? But your work could be much more effective. That's huge. Um, Years ago, I remember coming into I forget where it was I was interviewing, one of the jobs I had, and people said, "Well, what are you going to bring?" And I said, well, it looked like in this case they were doing all sorts of things, but it was all over the place. It wasn't systematic. It wasn't organized so they get the maximum results. And I said, well, if you bring in me or anybody like me, what you should be getting is not less work, but more effective work. And when you bring in a consultant, that's a lot of what you're looking for, is to become more effective and more systematic, not as scattered. You need to focus. Now, do you need a nonprofit specialist? And, the answer is no, if the work is universal in nature. And, or if you're looking for a business perspective. So what I'm saying here, like universal in nature, a lot of IT work, honestly, it really doesn't matter whether it's done for a small business, for a nonprofit, for a government entity. Windows is Windows, right? Apple is Apple. And so if you have somebody who can deal with what you're doing and they happen to do it for other kinds of organizations, that's fine. That's not a problem. Graphic design might be another one of these. So there's certain kinds of consulting work that people are going to come in that have universal work across business sectors. And then, of course, I think it's important that if somebody were to bring you a business perspective, that's not a bad thing, right? That might. Now, I'm not, and I could do a whole nother session on the businessization of nonprofits and whether that's good or bad. But some people are looking for a different angle on something. Not a problem bringing somebody who's not a nonprofit specialist. However, I will also say that these same people need to understand the culture, and it might be some education on your part, right? And the difference between nonprofits, for-profits, governments, and how that impacts the work they do for you versus the work they're doing for one of their other clients. So there are a lot of times you don't necessarily need a nonprofit specialist. However, there are a lot of times when you do, especially when the work is specific to your mission, or just nonprofits in general. I mean, what comes to mind right off the top of my head is fundraising, grant proposal writing, right? That is specific to nonprofits. Businesses, government, they're not going to do that kind of work. Nonprofits are. You need somebody who is a nonprofit specialist in that world. Also, a lot of mission expertise is simply focused on nonprofits. If you're doing certain healthcare policy work, say, or if you're doing bird counts or oceanography, whatever it is, right? That there are some things that is just important that, that's tagged to your mission, and they will likely only be nonprofit people for that. So you need to look out for those. Now, this is important, whoever you get, to understand that consultants aren't employees. And first of all, there's some legal issues here. And I would encourage anybody to look up the IRS 20-question test about whether somebody is I think they call them contractors, or an employee, because really, a lot of times it comes down to whether they can set their own hours and their own method of doing something. And It helps if they have other clients and it doesn't look like they're working exclusively for you. But there's all these, so I'll leave that up to you to Google. And there's a lot of articles out there on that. But there are some legal definitions here that you ought to be aware of. In hiring practices, like we said earlier, a lot of times consultants are brought in outside the HR system. So while there are a lot of good things in HR practices that are applicable to bring in a consultant, you may not be under the monitoring influence of that department in your organization. So that kind of makes a little bit of a difference. And then socially, it's important that you understand that there is a different social dynamic with consultants. And it's not because anybody wants to be different necessarily. It's just the nature of somebody coming in episodically, or maybe if they're there, on an ongoing basis, but they're only going to be there for a period of time. You might end up treating them differently. You might end up, depending on their personality, have other things that you can, that you will put up with that you wouldn't necessarily put up with employees because they're only going to be there for a certain. Now, I'm not talking about anything egregious. I'm just talking about just kind of how people work together. Where they do their work will impact that. If they're, of course, working from a home base, that's different than working from your office, right? But just keep that in mind, that that it could be different socially that way. Now, politically, this is an important issue here, right? That hiring consultants aren't always popular with the staff because they might think, well, that consultant's getting big bucks, right? That you could use elsewhere, maybe in my paycheck. It's just, folks will think these things. They might be threatened by the consultant. They're to take their job, make them look bad, get rid of them. They might be jealous of the attention and the pay, right? Big bucks that the consultant gets, that every time that person's in, I can't meet with the boss, and it's like that they don't like that. So that's important to keep in mind, right? And another political issue is, especially with folks who are leadership and they have consultants, will the board think I can't handle things? Yeah, they might. They might think that you're bringing a consultant because you just can't do the job. That's why you need to have the conversations with the organizational leadership in terms of the board, or if you're in a position or somebody between you and the board, about why a consultant might be the best thing to do that will help your organization move ahead in a very efficient way. Because a lot of folks have this preconceived image of a consultant, right or wrong, all sorts of ways, right? And so you might even avoid using the C word, the consultant word, right? They might think consultant means there's trouble or there's an expense issue or something like that. Now, won't the board, back to the board, right? You have to to sell this to them. Think about describing your need and the expected results in terms of mission delivery. That's really important. You want to focus on cost savings, time savings, income generation, because right, in a nonprofit, we're all about mission. And so if you can point to why a consultant, even if it's like a fundraising consultant, right, why that's going to help mission, now you are moving ahead on selling why this is an important thing for you to do, assuming that you believe that, which I hope you would. Okay, making your selection. I just threw out, then when you get the PDF here, you can take a more careful look at this, right? But I threw out a bunch of attributes of a great consultant. Right? You want them to be a fearless speaker, to have self-confidence, to have technical know-how, be relatable, organized, right? Okay, you're not going to find all these. I'm sorry. I would love to have all consultants do this. No, but you have to pick the attributes that are really important for you and match them with what you need and the kind of people you're seeing come in front of you. But take a look at this at your leisure here. I think you'll find some that will be connected for you and what you need. So how do you find these people? This is really, a lot of folks get really tied up on this, is that, Where are these consultants? Where are they hiding? Honestly, consultants don't want to be hidden. they they live on what the business they get, and so yet making that match is really hard because you may not know about them. They're the right person. They may not know that you need. How can they tell that you need something, right? So first place to go is your network. Go to your board. Go to people who might already be consultants with you, right? Colleagues from outside your organization, staff inside your organization. Work your network and start asking around. You can be discreet about it, right? Maybe you don't want to throw right out that, hey, we're getting a consultant for, but you might start hearing the same names come up again and again. And now you're saying, okay, I'm hearing good things about this person. Let's make a contact. Let's find out. Go check out their LinkedIn page, things like that. Professional associations. On the other side of this coin, tell consultants all the time to engage in professional associations. First of all, it gives them visibility, right? They build more expertise in whatever that association does, but it also helps that connection for you to find them and to actually do some, we'll call it pre-work with somebody. If you're on a committee and you're working with a consultant and who happens also to be part of that organization, and you find out that person is reliable, you get along with them, all these other attributes that you really like, that's going to be somebody you're going to call and you want to connect with. So your involvement in a professional association and theirs will make that connection happen. You can advertise. And I've seen advertising anywhere from Craigslist, yes, to professional publications like the Chronicle of Philanthropy and others, where folks are looking for consultants. It doesn't happen a lot. But it happens out there. I'm not sure, it's like anything. At this point, it feels more like an HR search, for a position. You might get a lot of folks of various skills that you may or may not want, but it's certainly an avenue. And then reach out into your social media networks as well. Either selectively, you might do something more broadly. Actually, I've always found LinkedIn advertising to be pretty effective for some things. But that's important to look at. Let's see. So when you make your selection, one of the most important things you need to do is identify your need. What's the pain that the consultant can cure? And because alleviating this pain is what it's all about, right? You want to be specific, and being specific will go a long way to getting whatever you need taken care of, right? And be open to suggestions. Consultants will bring a lot of experience to the table. Even in the engagement process, they're going to see issues that you may not see. And so be open to having that conversation. Maybe you don't need the campaign you think you need, or maybe you're too early for the campaign and you need to build the case better or define, what it is, whatever, these folks, typically my experience is that just about any consultant I know, at least who's worked with nonprofits for any length of time, really does have their potential clients' best interests in mind when they're going in to work with somebody or talking about it. So, listen to early feedback, and you might get a lot of good information. Now, talking about that early feedback, I think it's really important to realize that, any consultant should pretty much give you, whether it's on the phone, through Zoom or Skype or in person, get an hour or so, get to know somebody, right? That's part of that sales process for them. It's part of your selection process for you. That's a good thing. You learn about them and their background. They learn about you, whether it's a good fit. And by the way, don't be surprised if a consultant will tell you, you're not a good fit for me. Okay, that's all right. That's better to hear early on than somebody who's desperate to want that job and isn't a good fit but takes it anyhow. So, but that conversation isn't about getting dirt on other clients. Don't expect a consultant to break confidentiality about other clients that they have. And that's kind of tough for a consultant because they want to be able to tell you the good things they did, but there are some good things they did they can't talk about. Now, they might be able to talk about it in broader terms, But if you ask them for specifics, say, well, don't be offended if they say they can't tell you who they did whatever that job was for, because they might be under confidentiality agreements for that, which is, and think about yourself. You want them not to talk about, if you don't want them to talk about your stuff, they're going to respect that if you're echoing that back. And, don't expect specific solutions for free. That's really kind of unfair to the consultant. They probably don't know enough about your work at that point to really give something that's like really targeted that you're going to run with and then forget about them. But I've been in situations, and I know other people have, where clients will kind of pump them for information. They're kind of under the guise of looking at people for consultants, and then end up not using them. And that's not a happy thing for most folks involved. They're being generous that way. So don't be offended if they say that they can't really get into something until after we get into a contract situation. Now, size matter? Maybe. The consulting colossus has a lot of stuff to bring, as does the single shingle folks, right? So first thing is, you gotta ask, right, are you meeting the person who is going to work with your job? And that's really important, because in bigger companies, you may or may not. It's single shop, obviously you will, or if it's one or a small partnership or something. So that's important, to be comfortable with that person. Now, sometimes the bigger companies are going to have targeted resource people on their staff. Maybe they're going to have research specialists or IT specialists, somebody they can just almost pull right off the shelf and plug into your project. Smaller firms you're going to depend on their network. They might be able to offer the same services, but it's going to be through a networking relationship, and they may or may, it's just a little different approach to that same process. So just keep that in mind. Bigger firms tend to be more expensive than smaller firms, not always, but that often will happen. Bigger firms will often have project oversight where smaller firms may not. So, you have to think about whether that's important to you or not. And then, like I said, the smaller firms could be a little less expensive because they don't have the overhead. So just consider, as you're looking at the size of the consulting firm you're bringing in, what some of the good and bad things are for your project. And that's really important. So you might, in fact, say, listen, we're just going to do a RFP, right? Request for proposal. And from your point of view, this is a good thing. You're doing your due diligence, you're encouraging competition, you're seeing a variety of approaches to your problems. You can compare apples to apples. That's a great thing. RFPs are good often for the nonprofits who put them out. I say often, right? From the consultant point of view, maybe not so much, right? Because a lot of times they say, well, and I know people will say this. In fact, I read something from a pretty prominent fella I know out in the Midwest who says he doesn't do RFPs anymore because he's found that the chances of success are low. It's hard to discern a lot of times just from that document what's really wanted. Even though they say, oh, call us and find out more, it's still not always clear. A lot of times the process focuses on price, not value. And this is really, I think, what gets a lot of folks, is that sometimes these processes can hinge on the politics of the committee, not the quality of the work. And I know that's not universal, and that might be unfair, but I've seen it happen. Other folks have told me they do. So it's between the amount of work that a consultant puts in and the chances of getting it. I think that if you're going to put out RFPs and you're going to invite specific firms, you really need to assure them that they have a reasonable shot at getting the work, and have some conversation with them, almost to sell the RFP process to some folks, because there's a lot of good quality firms won't even do them because they just see that the chances are that they're not going to get it for any number of reasons that are out of their control. All right, but regardless, when you make your selection, you have to be clear on expectations. What is the specific work product you want? Make a list of what's important to you, right? Timeliness, format, right? Communication style is huge, right? Whether you want to be communicated with by email, phone, postal mail, visits, right? What kind of project work and the specific outcomes you're looking for. Do you want expertise in certain areas or not? And do you want their advice versus their action? And that's important to understand too. And of course, the cost, right? Make sure that you have an idea of how much you can spend. And that brings us to, right, how can you tell whether somebody is qualified or not? Well, you know, this is a really tough thing. Think about grant proposal writers. You know, the stats don't show the whole picture. If you know about grant writing, right, you know that that the writing doesn't always get the funding. A lot of it is relationship that the grant writer has nothing to do with, or it might be the selection of the prospects that the grant writer has nothing to do with. So ask for stories, right? I think that one of the best ways to interview a consultant, just like you interview a job candidate, is to ask for stories about how they conduct their work and where they went with that and how that worked for them. And then, you know, ask other people also about what, you know, you're going to evaluate a bunch of them. Think about how not only do you do that, does the consultant do that job, but if you don't know that job and how it's supposed to be done, talk to other people who do know in your network and say, you know, I've never written a grant proposal before. What should I be looking for? They will give you some of the cues that you can ask in your discussion with the potential consultant. Now, cost, pay, right? Why do consultants charge so much? Right? Well, because they pay their own healthcare, taxes, other HR benefits, all the stuff that a lot of people with paycheck jobs just get, consultants are on their own to do. They also will pay for their own professional resources, you know, directories, computers, memberships, you know, paper, tablets of paper. Maybe they have their own account at Staples, who knows? But that's out there. Plus, you know, the other thing is it's impossible. Well, let's say impossible. It's really hard, particularly for independent consultants, to book 40 hours a week, because they are out there networking. They are out there taking care of the accounting books. They are doing all sorts of things that just simply don't add up to 40 billable hours. So to make a living, theirs is going to be more. Plus, there's something else that comes up too, is that, you know, they might have spent an hour doing your job, but they spent 30 years learning what to do in that hour. And so they actually have value they're bringing to the table that goes beyond just what it is that that hour represents. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, are you paying the right price? A little different question, right? And how do you discern that market price? Well, you know, number one, if you're in a hiring mode for a consultant, you know, you're going to get estimates from several consultants. It's almost guaranteed to be a bell curve. You're going to might find an outlier at the top and the bottom, and kind of folks clustered in the middle there. And you have to ask some of your external colleagues, you know, just what are they paying? What is it that they're getting for this? Now, on my other side of life, talk about in nonprofits, it's easy for consultants, particularly early in their work, to offer Neiman Marcus service at a Walmart price. It's really hard for those folks to survive. And so if you're getting somebody at the bottom, consider that maybe they're undercharging for what they do, or maybe they are not, you know, they're early on in their career or something like that. That could be good, you know, it could be bad, but just understand the dynamics of that bell curve and what you're getting for your money and what their experience is that they bring to you. Less is not always good, because less will often take longer to do and end up costing you more. More isn't always bad, because you're going to get it done quick and efficient. All right. Now, the other question that comes up is, should they pay less because you're a nonprofit? And not typically, a lot of times you're dealing with people who only deal with nonprofits, so that can be a problem. You expect them to do that because that's all their clients. Um, you know, should they volunteer their time? That's asking a lot of somebody whose job it is. They're making their living, they're feeding their family off of being a consultant. Now, a lot of folks, should they make a charitable gift to you? You got to look at the line there between that and kind of a kickback, and is that ethical or not for you to ask that or for them to do it? A lot of it has to do with timing, whether they feel it's voluntary or not. So just keep that in mind. And of course, your budget will dictate a lot of this. So yeah, there's a lot of dynamics here about understanding whether you're paying the right price. And of course, how you pay, hourly, by the job, are the most common. If you're doing fundraising, commission is off the table. So it's important, though, especially to understand that maybe by the job, is the best thing because you're locked in to a price and they don't have to count hours. But a lot of folks like to work hourly, and that's fine. Either way is fine. And it could be hourly, it could be weekly, it could be monthly, whatever it is, but some form of time. Now, how the mechanics of it, at all at once up front, maybe at the end, some sort of payment schedule. Those are all potentially out there for you. Depends on the size of the job. It depends on the nature of it. And of course, checks, credit cards, sometimes PayPal. Honestly, I've not got a lot of credit cards. Usually I bill them, I end up getting a check. But it depends on the organization. Some bigger ones actually will do credit cards. Paperwork. Now, this is really important because I have had some organizations give me their contract, and it's been simply wrong because their standard contract is really looking at somebody who sells them paper or sells them some product like that, and not either consulting services, or if it is consulting services and I do fundraising consulting, it doesn't meet their state's guidelines for a proper fundraising consulting contract. So you need to show a little flexibility there, because your consultant might actually be able to educate you on that point. And of course, go through a legal review, make sure it's appropriate wherever you need to be. There's nothing wrong with that. Penalty and incentive clauses are good as long as they don't get into what looks like a commission, but you could float that and see if that works for them. I don't know. Depends on the nature of the consulting they're doing. I know for a lot of energy companies, the ones who come in and say, well, if we save you X number of dollars, they'll take some of it. It's kind of in their field, so that works. That's kind of a tradition in that subfield. But penalty and incentive clauses can be problematic for some. And of course, confidentiality. Although one of the things that I really try to ask my clients to do is allow me to publicize the fact I work with them, because that you'd be surprised at that level of advocacy that a lot of your consultants will do for you if you open up that gate, and they will talk positively about your organization in the broader nonprofit community. And for the ones, at least I usually do this. I know a lot of folks who do, and if you kind of clamp down on that, you really take away some marketing potential for your own organization. Now, important, there are a lot of paperwork and special license kind of things you need to deal with, particularly in fundraising. Is somebody, especially we'll call it licensed, registered to be a fundraising counsel or solicitor in your state? That's important to keep in mind, that you will have, and go to either Secretary of State or there's some sources. If somebody want to pop me a note, give them some places to look, but of where you can find out whether your state requires this or not. 37 of them do in the United States. But there are other things like child protection, like background checks, for criminal background checks. And it's important to clarify who pays for those. Do you require insurance? That's something else that's important to keep in mind. I have a client who everybody has to have errors and emissions insurance. That's fine, but you have to be also clear, and some consultants will have that and some won't, and the job has to be worth it for them to do that. Now, how can you tell if they're working? Hiring a consultant is not a set it and forget it thing. There are no ta-da moments where somebody lifts up the cape and shows the product end, right? You got to have ongoing communication. And now, you may not see them in your office every day, but there's nothing wrong with being able to pick up the phone and saying, hey, how are things going? Where's this project heading, right? Look for drafts. Look for that sharing of ideas back and forth. That's really important to do as we're in this process of doing the job itself. Now, at the end, right? Obviously, there are two ways this thing can go. We're either good news or bad news, right? And you have to accepting the final product is important in that you have to say, was the job done, right? Go back to the contract and look, is it done to your satisfaction? What results were you hoping for? Can you get them, would you write them a recommendation? And honestly, that's like gold to a lot of consultants. If you can write them a recommendation, they would love that. And that shows that, things went well, and that's really important. The consultant might want to share that final product clients. That's nice marketing for you, and also kind of a nice pat in the back for them. Talk good about them because among your colleagues, because they live on recommendations and referrals, and people want to know who the good folks are to go to. Now, on the other side of that, right? Yeah, sometimes things don't go well. You can passively and just don't give them any more work, let the contract run out, not renew. But I also think it's important to, if you can, if it's appropriate, to be upfront about why things may not have worked out quite the way you wanted them, and have that conversation, because a lot of time, and it's not like I know there might be some conflict here. It would be nice if it were a learning experience. I think it happens too few times, but worst comes to worst, just say thank you very much and off you go. But don't take a bad consulting experience to represent consultants generally, because it usually doesn't. And my guess is in the beginning they came in doing with the intention of doing all the best work for you. So something just wasn't a good match. You got to go back and look at your process in the beginning of how you ended up picking that person, and maybe how you might change that in the future. So just about every role in a nonprofit, in my opinion, can be filled by a consultant. In fact, I know a board who has outsourced their entire function of their nonprofit to a consulting firm. And it's fascinating to see. But I really think that you can do a lot more with consultants, take advantage of this gig economy out there. But it hinges on your board's endorsement of using consultants. Your communication is huge with the people you're working with. What you are defining their role to be, being very precise about that. That's a major issue. And then, of course, the expectations for the work product, because in the end, you need to get out of this relationship what you need for moving your nonprofit forward. They have to understand that. I'm sure they do. And you have to stand back and evaluate whether that's done for you or not.